So, welcome everyone to, as I said, the first of our Wellbeing Hub monthly talks. Tonight we are delighted to welcome speaker Pete Wharmby, who's going to be talking about sensory comfort for autistic people. And I'll introduce you to Pete in a few moments. First of all, though, just want to go through our plan for this evening. First thing, I'm going to just introduce you to the Wellbeing Hub team in case you haven't met any of us before. Also go through a little bit of housekeeping about the webinar and how it's going to work. Also, for those of you who don't know much about the Wellbeing Hub, I'm going to just give a very brief summary of what it is and what we're doing, and then I'm going to hand over to Pete. His talk is going to last for about 45 minutes, and then there's going to be a Q&A afterwards. I don't know why that keeps coming and going on my screen, so apologies for that. So, in terms of the team, project leads on myself, Dr. Jo Billington, and I don't know what's happening with these slides, I apologise. This isn't going to plan at all, is it? In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stop sharing that because that is just really annoying. Basically, the project leads are myself, Dr. Jo Billington, and my colleague, Dr. Fiona Knott, who is kind of waving on the screen there. And we also have our Executive Administration Officer, Hazel, who is also on the screen waving to you now. Those of you who have emailed the Centre for Autism or the Autism@ email address will have talked to Hazel in the past. In terms of the Wellbeing Hub, essentially this is a brand new project we started in November of last year, and essentially what it's rooted in is this idea that we know a lot about autistic distress, we know a lot about autistic ill health, we have a large research literature on that subject, but what we know a lot less about is autistic thriving and autistic flourishing, and what it means to live a good life, a good authentic life as an autistic person. And so that's our focus at the Wellbeing Hub, to bring some curiosity to that question. What does it mean to live a good life, the best life for an autistic person? And essentially what we're doing in our first year, because as I say, we've only just started, is we've got a number of things that we're running. So first of all are these monthly talks that are open to the general public that we're going to be running, as I say, every month apart from Easter and the summer break. And those are talks that are all centred around the idea of autistic thriving and how can we know more about what that means. Typically, we would have an autistic person like Pete tonight who's going to be delivering that talk, but we may also have researchers and autistic allies and people who are working with autistic people in education, health and social care, for example. But all the main thread is that it's always focused on thriving and flourishing. We've also got a special interest group, which we are holding in person here at the University of Reading, which is set up for professionals who work with autistic people to share neurodiversity affirming practice and to enable networking. And our next one of those is coming up in February. We're also doing work in schools and with families, again, to support neurodiversity affirming approaches. And we're very excited this year to be beginning our work directly with autistic children and young people, aimed at increasing their levels of agency and autonomy and authenticity. And that work starts later this year. But of course, we're a university, so we're also really interested in training the clinical professionals of the future with our placement students who support the Hub, and also making a meaningful contribution to the research literature. So everything we do at the Hub is being documented for publication and research so that we can share the expertise and the community that we're trying to build here. But back to the monthly talks. So tonight we have Pete Wharmby, who is an autistic author, advocate, tutor, parent, and speaker. His work centres around sharing more about the autistic experience so that society can be more accepting and understanding of autistic ways of being. Pete is the author of 2 solo authored books and also a contributor to other books about educational practice, as he was once a secondary school teacher. And all of the information about his books, about his talks, about his activism is all available on his website, petewharmby.com. And in a moment when Pete starts to talk, I will put a link to his website in the chat. As I say, Pete's going to talk for about 45 minutes, something like that, and then we'll take questions. But we've got a lot of people in the room tonight. We've got 108 people so far. And so Pete isn't going to be able to take questions via the microphone or coming onto the camera. What we're going to do instead is, if you have a question for Pete, could you please use the Q&A option that's in your menu bar? It looks like a little speech mark with a question mark inside it with the letters Q&A underneath. If you click on that, you can add your question there. And then what I'll do throughout the evening is I'll try and group those questions into themes. So apologies in advance if your specific question doesn't get answered, but we will do our best, energy levels permitting, because we're getting towards the end of the day. We'll do our best to get through as many of those questions as we can. But as I say, I'm likely to group them into themes for Pete, just for ease. But with that in mind, no further ado, I'm going to hand over to you now, Pete. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jo. I'm just making sure my mic's on, and it is. That's good. Yeah, thanks for that, Jo. It's really nice to be here to talk about something that's really quite important to me, which is, you know, this idea of autistic thriving, this idea of autistic people being able to actually live a relatively happy, content and reasonable life, which unfortunately, as we know, can be very, very challenging and can feel sometimes like it's just impossible to achieve, especially because it feels like we're so often having to fight the world around us, you know, every moment of every day. It can feel like that idea of thriving can be very distant indeed. But I want to talk today about what happens around sensory sensitivity and finding sensory comfort, you know, being able to perhaps advocate for ourselves, to be able to feel more confident and more comfortable when asking for adjustments, for example, and also looking inward a little bit and thinking about what our sensory experience actually is. Okay, because there's this big assumption, I think, that's often made by pretty much everyone, actually, autistic and non-autistic at times, that the moment that you're diagnosed as autistic, that you suddenly magically become the expert of your own autistic experience. And of course, we don't. You know, we don't. We are in many ways the expert of our experience because we've lived it. But in terms of actually making sense of it, that can take time, and you can often need help with that. You know, especially if it's kind of completely new to you, you haven't got any connection with the community, and, you know, someone's just told you, oh, by the way, you're autistic. It can take a bit of time and effort to actually figure out exactly what that means, not just with regard to sensory stuff, but also with regard to pretty much everything else as well. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that as well. Okay, but I think it's probably the most sensible thing to do, with that in mind, to think about the basics. You know, what do we mean when we talk about sensory comfort? What do we mean when we talk about sensory sensitivity? Because you know, it's all very well and good having this term, but we need to know what that actually entails. So I'm going to do my best fairly briefly, just to really get to, you know, so we all feel like we've got to grips with what's actually going on there. So when we talk about autistic sensory experience, what we're really addressing is the fundamental fact that it seems that autistic people experience the world through their various senses in a way that is significantly different to the way that non-autistic people do. Which sounds incredibly vague, but it kind of has to be, because the incredible variation within that difference is huge. You know, it's not so simple as just to say, oh, autistic people have massive sensory oversensitivity. That would be a nonsense. That simply isn't true. It's not as simple as that. So we have to, unfortunately, be fairly vague about this. But it's enough to say that, yes, as an autistic person, my sensory experience is significantly different to the experience of, you know, a random non-autistic person. Okay, so that's number one. That's the kind of core of the whole matter. Number two, of this list, which I'm creating in my head right now, is that our autistic sensory experience, despite being different, is not so different that it is completely alien to non-autistic people. I think that's important to note. There is very little when it comes to autistic sensory experience that is utterly unrelatable for a non-autistic person. Generally speaking, much of what autistic people experience on a sensory level can at least in part be imagined, I think, by a non-autistic person, if they if they can be bothered to try to do that. To be a bit cheeky there, but I think that's an important proviso. This is crucial, I think, because there is a tendency, I think, amongst both non-autistic people and even newly diagnosed autistic people to add an air of mystery around autism. It's a mysterious thing. It's very hard to explain and very, very confusing. And, we often, in medical circles or educational circles, it's often described as complex. Complex. What does this mean? And I always like to challenge that a little bit and say that actually, when you really boil it down, to its bare bones, which is a grotesque image, and I do apologize for that, it's actually not that complicated, really. And much of what an autistic person will experience, like I say, can be imagined by others. I always do, when I do talks, around the country, around the world, even these days, I'll often start by asking the non-autistic people in the audience, when was the last time you felt embarrassment from a miscommunication? Getting the wrong end of the stick, or not getting a joke or something like that. I'll ask them when the last time they felt really uncomfortable on a sensory level, the last time they had wet socks, or they were irritated by a car alarm, or things like this, And of course, they all have stories, and they delight in telling us, oh yeah, that thing really bothered me, or I still lie awake thinking about that time when I said that thing. The point is, any autistic people in the room here will know that we have even more of those stories, and all of this is much more extreme, perhaps, for us, more regular, more frequent, more affecting, etc., etc. But it's recognizable as being the same kind of thing. It's just different in terms of its level, its intensity, and the effect that it might have on us. Okay, so that's the second thing. The third thing that we need to get our heads around about sensory sensitivity or sensory unsensitivity is that variability within the individual as well. Okay, it's an incredibly varied experience, sensory, the autistic sensory thing. All autistic people will have a very different sensory experience to everybody else. Okay, it's not a blanket thing. You often hear, well, I do anyway, that I think people naturally assume that, for example, all autistic people are super sensitive to sound, or all autistic people are super sensitive to taste and might have a fairly limited range of food that they can happily eat. That they seem to be fairly common stereotypes. But of course, we know that that's not the case at all. That every autistic person has a very distinct sensory profile. Of some sensory experiences that, yes, they can often feel to be very extreme and very sensitive to, and get kind of overwhelmed by, but also other sensory experiences that they barely notice, or they're even undersensitive to. And that varies from individual to individual. And even then, within an individual, it can vary. I'm sure any autistic people here might be familiar with the experience of one day feeling extraordinarily sensitive to something that the next day barely bothers you at all. So it's variability all the way down. Hence why at the very beginning, all I could really say is our sensory experience is different. Any more than that, and we're being too specific, and it's impossible. So we have to understand that if you yourself are autistic, that your sensory experience is likely to be different to other autistic people that you know. And if you're not autistic, and you're here listening to this, you have to understand that this is a really crucial point. The autistic experience of our sensory world varies enormously from individual to individual and within the person too. And that this means that any assumptions that you might make about autistic sensory experience are likely to be flawed, and any expectations of consistency are likely to be, well, frustratingly like inaccurate, because it can be pretty inconsistent. But what are these senses? What are these senses that I keep talking about? Well, we all know the main five, don't we? Because we learned about that at primary school. And it's a very interesting thing that I genuinely believe that no one can ever comfortably and confidently name all five senses really fast if you just went up to them in the street and asked them to. You're always going to forget one. So here we go. I did a talk on this last night and I'm still petrified I'm going to miss one of them. It's usually taste or smell that I forget about. Right, so you've got vision, sight, you've got sound, hearing, you've got smell or olfactory, if you want to be, posh and academic. You've got touch, and you've got taste, okay, gustatory. You've got those five basic senses, which are the ones that I think everyone's familiar with and everyone learned about at school, and usually they are the ones that people tend to talk about when we talk about autistic sensory experience. We talk about things that are too loud, we talk about places that are too bright, we talk about foods that are too strong, we talk about smells that are too unpleasant or too much, and we talk about textures, yes, there we are, textures that are too, scratchy or whatever. Okay, they tend to be fairly familiar to us. What is less familiar about all five of those, of course, as I've already touched upon, is that it can work both ways. It's not just about being oversensitive to something, although that tends to get the limelight. That tends to be the thing that people like to talk about the most. It tends to be the thing that people focus on, when they're making their memes or their used to be Twitter, comments or Facebook posts or whatever. I think because, it's always relatable, we like to talk about the stuff that we might find overbearing. And because of that, it's easy to forget about the flip side, which is the hyposensitivity, the undersensitivity, which can happen or occur just as frequently. It's probably just not quite as rock and roll. It's not quite as exciting to talk about, I suppose, by its very nature, because you're not sensitive to it, so you barely notice it. So, who wants to talk about that? But because of that, that's actually a bit of a problem, because it means that people don't know about it, and actually it can have real big ramifications, not least in terms of creating this general sense of inconsistency, and one day being one thing, another day being another. But there are more senses than just those five, and we have to be very aware of those. And I can't possibly go into all of them, mostly because I don't know all of them. I'm an English teacher by trade. That's what I used to do for 15 years. My degree is in English literature. I'm not a scientist. I know that we have many senses, but my knowledge of them tends to focus around 8. Okay, so we've got the basic 5 that we've already talked about, and then you've got the other 3, as I tend to refer to them. So I tend to focus on proprioception, interoception, and vestibular, the vestibular sense. Okay, always going to forget one. Anyway, so you might have come across these, or you might not have done. They are the lesser talked about ones, but in my opinion, they're actually far more fascinating, especially interoception. I find interoception differences to be really interesting, and they explain an awful lot as well. So let's just go into them a little bit. Proprioception, and bearing in mind, English teacher, so do forgive me if I get any specific academic details wrong. Proprioception is the ability, your brain's ability to identify where parts of your body are in space. Okay, so it's actually quite easy to test and have a bit of fun with this. I'm not going to demand that you all do it, because that would be mean, and it's a Thursday evening and no one wants to be told what to do, especially if you're autistic. But if you do feel like trying it out, it's a simpler case of just closing your eyes, waggling your hand around and trying to figure out if you know what you're kind of vaguely pointing at. And the chances are that you probably do, that you'll open your eyes and your hand will be exactly where you imagined it to be. It's our ability to be able to close our eyes and touch our own nose. Because we just we just know somehow where things are. And that, like the other senses, can be over or under sensitive, and that comes with all kinds of interesting ramifications. Then you've got the vestibular sense, which is all to do with balance, being able to stay upright, and vertical, which is what we human beings, for whatever reason, that was the way that we decided we wanted to move around the world. We were done with that whole being on all fours nonsense. We wanted to stand tall, and it causes terrible havoc on your knees and your back and your hips and everything else, but that's the way we wanted to do it. So we need a really honed sense of balance, of knowing where we are and how to stay upright so we're not falling over all the time. And as any autistic people here may well experience, especially if you've been diagnosed as dyspraxic, that whole falling over thing, yeah, it happens, doesn't it? And then that could well be an undersensitivity perhaps to the vestibular sense. So it's, again, interesting to consider. And then you've got interoception, which is the body's way of interpreting internal messaging. So whereas our 5 main senses that we talk about are all about experiencing the outer world and figuring out what the outer world is telling us and showing us, interoception, which you can probably tell from the name, interior, ception, like understanding. Interoception is the internal version of that, looking into oneself and recognizing the messages that exist there. So this doesn't necessarily mean like following your heart or anything like that. It's more technical and biological than that. It's things like recognizing that you're hungry, that you need to drink, you need to eat, you need to go to the toilet, all of those what's the term for equilibrium? I can't remember. That biological equilibrium that we all have to maintain at all times. I've forgotten the word. But that's what interoception helps us to maintain. It helps keep us fed, watered, gone to the loo, slept, all those kind of things. And for autistic people, yeah, I mean, I know that I'm very undersensitive to my interoception. The messages don't get through. I don't find out. I suffer from headaches, and I think one of the reasons for that is because I don't realize that I'm thirsty, so therefore I end up with a dehydration headache, by the kind of mid-afternoon sometimes, because I'm just not drinking. I have the same problem with my daughter. You have to always be saying, drink some more, come on, drink your water. I always have a load of drinks lined up when I do this kind of thing. Water. Please don't misunderstand that. like a row of alcoholic drinks. No, I need to have lots that I can just remember to keep swigging, because talking and doing this, it's very tiring, and it takes a lot of energy, so I need to keep myself well watered. So all 8 of those senses can either be over or undersensitive, or they could just be neither, and just like neutral, just whatever, and they can fluctuate over time as well. Okay, so one of the very first things that any autistic person really ought to do when they find out that they're autistic, if they haven't figured it out for themselves already, in my opinion, is work out what their sensory profile is. Actually sit down and have a proper good old think about what they reckon is the deal with this. And it took me a year or two, I think, to really get to grips with where my trigger points were and what the things were that didn't bother me so much. And I actually learned quite a lot about myself in the process. I went into it, this kind of thought experiment, and don't worry, I wasn't like sitting in an empty room like Sherlock, anytime I had the chance to think about it, I'd just have a bit of a think about it. The thing that really surprised me, I'd always assumed that it was going to be sound, that was going to be the really big one for me. And it is, don't get me wrong, I am very definitely sensitive to sound. Repetitive, unwanted noises cause me tremendous stress and unhappiness. And I thought that was my big one. And I thought that after that, maybe sight was the, visual was the big one for me as well, because I can struggle a bit sometimes with how bright it is, or if there's too many things on the wall, too much kind of visual information. I didn't think touch was a big one for me, because the stereotypical example that was always given of touch, and even I gave it earlier in this talk, is that one about scratchy labels, scratchy clothing. And that wasn't something specifically that I recognized very much. I don't remember, certainly in adult life, worrying too much about the scratchiness of clothing. So I just assumed that touch wasn't a problem for me. But when I gave it some more thought, And I realized that actually, technically speaking, temperature sort of comes under touch, doesn't it? And so does kind of humidity and moisture and that sort of thing. And I started to realize, well, actually, yeah, I really do struggle with that. And even if the scratchiness of clothing doesn't affect me too badly, the fit definitely does. If something feels too tight or too flappy or too small or too big, I can get very, very upset very easily. But I hadn't figured this out for myself. I was experiencing the negative effects of these sensory messages, of being oversensitive to the fit of my clothing, but I wasn't aware of it. I knew I was unhappy and felt uncomfortable, but I didn't know why. And that wasn't helped by the fact that I'm alexithymic. So alexithymia is where you don't necessarily recognize your emotional state easily. You can't recognize it very well, and you certainly can't communicate it. And it's very difficult then to remove yourself from sources of stress because you don't realize you're experiencing it until too late. But over time, I realized this, and I was like, oh my word, I've actually had this, real sensitivity to clothing all my life. And wow, and now I know that I can take measures to make my life a little bit easier. Because, of course, the overall impact of all of this sensory experience, especially the oversensitivity, is stress. If you are constantly overstimulated by your environment, and for some people, all 5 senses, all 8 senses can be, a source of stress, a source of difficulty, then your stress levels are going to be absolutely stratospheric. Like, anyone who's non-autistic here, imagine trying to work or write an essay or, I don't know, do anything in a really busy, loud disco, club with flashing lights and loud music and people everywhere. Imagine trying to, get a bit of homework done in that setting, or trying to, cook dinner in that environment. Imagine trying to park your car while the radio's on full blast and there are people banging on the windows, shouting at you, and you're too hot and it's chucking it down with the rain. It's incredibly difficult. Your stress levels are high much of the time, and that has a very insidious effect on a person. You can't maintain high stress levels for prolonged periods. We're not meant to. We're meant to have, or meant to be able to find, solace from stress at times, but autistic people can really struggle with that. So we end up struggling horribly and getting poorly, ending up with I was diagnosed, I haven't proven the link here, but it's an interesting anecdote. Certainly, I was diagnosed as having very high blood pressure in my 20s, and I didn't know I was autistic then. I wasn't diagnosed until I was 34. I chalked it up to genetics because my dad was diagnosed with high blood pressure in his 20s. So I just thought, well, like father, like son, he must just be genetically predisposed to high blood pressure, and therefore so am I. And that's what I thought for a very long time, until I was diagnosed as autistic. And then it became very clear that my dad was too. And it was like, oh, okay. So what if this high blood pressure we both share isn't strictly just a biological thing that we were inevitably going to experience, but is actually a response to the prolonged stress of being autistic in a very difficult world? So it's vital, if we're going to thrive, if we're going to manage to find, an authentic way of enjoying and being the best, having the best life possible, it's important that we figure out our sensory experience, and it's important that we find ways to make our environment, our surroundings, our lives in every way as comfortable as possible. But in my head, there are 2 barriers to this that we've got to try and work through. One of them is other people. I mean, isn't that always the case? When I say that, I don't know if people will recognize this. And, if we're in a room together, I'll probably ask you to put your hands up, to be honest. But if you're autistic in this room, especially if you're young, how many of you have had the bravery, really, or the insight to be able to actually recognize, what, it is, I don't know, let's just say for sake of argument, too noisy in here. Okay, God, it's too noisy in here. I can't cope with this. You know, my sensitivity's through the roof. It's too loud, too many people, there's too many people talking. I need to get out. And you go to the nearest person and say, look, it's too noisy in here. I need to leave. Is that okay? And they respond with something along the lines of, no, it's not. And that's that. I'm sure I'm not alone in having experienced that. It'll be something along the lines of no, it's not, or don't be silly, or don't be daft, or if you're in the north, or oh, it's fine in here, I'm okay. I'm fine. So how could you possibly not be? It's a very, very, very common thing. Very common thing indeed. Autistic people, I think, are used to being sort of gaslighted. I know that term is overused, but I really think it's valid in this case. Being gaslighted about our own sensory experience because it's different and it's not exactly the same as the people around us. People have a tendency just to disbelieve and just to think you're trying to make a drama, or you're just making a fuss, you're trying to find an excuse, you just want to leave anyway because you don't want to be there, whatever it might be. People assume the worst. And for that reason, it can be very difficult to create a sensory comfortable space, because you're not just trying to make it happen on a practical level in terms of, cost and practicality and all that kind of thing. You're also having to sort of convince people that you need it in the first place, and that you're not just making it up, and that you're not just trying to be a problem, trying to cause issues for people. And that can be very demoralizing. I don't think it's unreasonable, if you've been met with that response, to just, especially a few times, to just sort of give up and just either think, well, I must be wrong. My own ears and eyes must be wrong. So I'm just a flawed, broken human being. So, well, I suppose I'll just suck it up. Or just thinking, well, I know I'm right, but nobody else cares or will do anything. So I'm just going to stop asking. And that can contribute to autistic masking. You're not just masking your autisticness in terms of, your stimming or your communication differences, eye contact, etc., etc. You're also masking your discomfort, and becoming, finding yourself in situations constantly that are, very, very uncomfortable, and that you really shouldn't be putting yourself through in any reasonable way. But you're doing it because what choice have you got? Because if you try to tell anyone that you can't do this, you just get laughed at or told to stop being silly. So it's a no-win situation. You're sort of doomed. So yeah, you've got other people to contend with. And even if they do believe you, even if they are okay with it and they do go along with it, and they're educated enough to know that this is an aspect of autism, and that, their experience of the world is not the be all and end all, you've also got that practicality thing of, are they actually going to be willing to help? Are they actually going to be willing to do the thing I need them to do? Are they going to have the money? Are they going to have the motivation? Are they going to care enough to actually make the change, whether it's in the home or at school or at work? There's a limit to what you can do for yourself. Sometimes you need other people to step in, and it's great if you've got an ally, somebody who'll advocate for you. But if you haven't, it can be a challenge. But I said there were two people that can be in the way when it comes to, creating a nice sensory environment. The other person is you. Not you personally, you, but the autistic person themselves. And I say this from my own experience. Especially, I think, if you're late diagnosed. I don't know how it would work if you've been diagnosed young and kind of grown up with that knowledge, but I certainly, and it might be part of the whole masking discomfort thing, but I find myself even now feeling bad for asking for things, or not asking for things, because I just feel like I'm asking for too much, and I don't deserve it, in some kind of self-sabotaging, low self-esteem kind of way. Like, oh, I couldn't possibly ask for that, it's unreasonable and I don't deserve it. It should go to other people. And I think we have to, I say this as somebody who does this, we have to try to avoid that. Sensory discomfort is real. It's a real thing. It can be very, very, very debilitating at times. It can cause tremendous stress. It can make situations very, very uncomfortable. And any autistic person who experiences that has to take whatever they can get to mitigate it, you know, because it is unsustainable. You know, you might be able to cope with it for a couple of years, you might be able to power through, you know, and just, you know, kind of, yeah, I can do this, but you can't keep it on for years and years and years and years. You can't keep putting yourself in uncomfortable positions. So you have to find a kind of happy place within yourself where you are confident enough that you can say, for example, you know what, I don't want to do that thing because on a sensory level, I will not be able to cope with it. It will be very uncomfortable for me, either hypersensitive or hyposensitive. Where you are able to just say, yeah, I can't do that, or I want to do this. Can't do that, want to do this, need to do this. And that's hard in itself, you know, especially if you're young and you don't have any real you know, true autonomy. Like, you know, I'm 40. If I need to buy myself a new lamp to replace the horrible light in my living room, I can do that. You know, no one's going to stop me apart from my own forgetting to do so. But if you know, if you're in your early teens or something like that, it can be very difficult to have that kind of power. You know, you've got to go through a middleman. You know, you've got to go through somebody who's going to make that happen for you, and that can make the whole thing more complicated and harder to achieve, because you've got that, you know, do they believe you, are they willing to do it, etc., etc., etc. So it's about finding ways to go through this, and it's about making sure that the people around you and that you yourself are as fully versed and as fully educated on this stuff as you can be, so you can go to other people and say, look, this is why I need this, this is why. And you can even say to yourself, this is why I need this, this is why. Okay, rather than thinking, you know, do I really need this? Do I really deserve it? You know, get yourself to the point where the people around you and you yourself know enough about the topic to feel confident in yourself to ask for this stuff. You know, and I mean, I'm talking about asking for stuff in a very vague way, and that's kind of by necessity. You know, the sort of adjustments or changes in your environment that could create your sensory comfort are going to be pretty much unique to you. You know, I can't sit here and tell you, I mean, mainly because I can't see anyone, I don't know anyone. You know, it's impossible for me to say, you know, well, this will always help, or this will, you know, do this and do this and do this, because it's so varied. But there are a few things that you always want to kind of take a look at. You know, when it comes to those 5 basic senses, you want to focus some of your time on working out, okay, so I've figured out that I'm hypersensitive to visual, to, you know, ocular things, you know, light, detail, things like colors, that kind of thing. So I figured that out. That's great. But now what do I do with that? You know, what, I've got that information, but what do I actually then do with it? And start to think a little bit about, well, you know, is it primarily brightness? Is it primarily busyness? You know, amount of detail, amount of words, perhaps? Is it colours that really get you down, or are you a visual seeker? Is it the other way, and you actually want more of that stuff in your life? Because that's the flip side, isn't it? You know, you might actually desperately want more sensory input. You have to figure that out for yourself and think to yourself, right, okay, you know, there was a wonderful part in one of Chris Packham's documentaries where he talked about one of his rooms that he had set up, which was very, very sparse and blank, and was possible to make it very, very dark indeed, which sounded ideal to me as a migraine sufferer, but also just made me think of how confident you have to be to go against society's norms and set up a room like that for yourself. You know, a room that if people were to come over and see it, you know, people would be like, oh, what's this for? You know, you have to have a real self-confidence about you, because, you know, I think there's an understanding that, you know, a house should be living room, dining room, kitchen, dining room if you're lucky, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, you know, and that actually you don't have to adhere to that. You know, you don't have to have pictures on the wall if it's too much for you, even though society might say that that's the way. You know, if you're a teenager and you know that society says your walls ought to be plastered with posters, that's what I did at university. I put posters on every inch of wall. And I don't think it did me any good, but I did it because I knew it was kind of expected of me, that I kind of had to, that's what people did. back in the early 2000s. You know, it was all kind of Family Guy posters and the Strokes and the Killers, you know, all those early 2000s bands that all started with the. I felt like that was something that I had to do. But actually, looking back, if I could have my time again, I wouldn't bother. You know, I would keep my walls nice and clear and enjoy the peace and quiet that would entail. But anyway, I'm going off on one a little bit. The fact is, we need to find that sensory comfort, and we need to find ways to ask for it from others, and we need to give ourselves the permission to actually achieve it as well. Okay, so to everyone here who's autistic, if you haven't done it already, I would recommend so strongly that you do spend some real quality time with yourself trying to figure out where your sensory triggers are. You know, ultimately, I realized that my sound and touch were about the same sensitivity, and I had real problems with them. They were prone to be oversensitive a lot of the time, not always, but a lot of the time. Whereas my visual sensitivity is very changeable. Some days it can be pretty oversensitive. Other days I don't notice anything, and it's pretty undersensitive. And I can kind of, look around in a busy environment and feel perfectly fine, or even, nothing at all. So that fluctuates a lot for me. Okay, so I don't, for that reason, I don't address it as much as I do the sound and the touch thing, because it's so changeable that I don't prioritize it. I guess I'd carry sunglasses around if I didn't have the sensitivity thing of feeling things on the bridge of my nose. I can't wear glasses. I can't wear sunglasses at all. It's a real problem. When it comes to smell, yeah, for me personally, I don't have to worry about that too much. I'm actually relatively okay with pleasant smells, more or less, as long as it's not too strong, too pungent. I don't mind the smell of aftershave. I don't mind the smell of perfume too much at all. I have a problem with bad smells, but then who doesn't? Nobody likes the smell of, I'm not even going to go there, just bad smells. But I do know, and I give myself permission now, that if there is a bad smell around, I just let myself leave if I need to. If I'm somewhere else, I'll just be like, yeah, I'm not doing this. I'm going to go outside. I'm not going to deal with this. Whereas before I would try and tolerate it. And with taste, for me personally, I don't have any issues at all at any point. Actually, it doesn't tend to come up. I'll eat pretty much anything, which I know is pretty unusual for a lot of autistic people, I believe. When it comes to proprioception, I know that my proprioception is very, very strong. I'm always hyper aware of where I am, if that makes sense, which is fine and doesn't really cause me too many problems. But it does mean that I often feel very kind of, I like the feeling of like a heavy blanket or something on me to kind of almost ground me, because otherwise I feel like I'm just always wanting to move or do something with these limbs of mine. You've probably noticed that I gesticulate pretty much all the time, and I like the feeling of that. It's a nice feeling, and I think that's a kind of proprioceptive sensory seeking behavior. But sometimes it gets me down and I just want to not move, and just stay still, and that can be quite challenging because I'm ADHD as well, so you can imagine how that interacts. With regard to vestibular, I fall over all the time, and being very tall, that's not great. I've got a long way to go to hit the floor. But yeah, I am fairly bad with that, and I'm not a sensory seeker for it either. I think people who are vestibular sensory seekers are probably those people that like to go on roller coasters and swingy roundy roundabouts and all that kind of stuff, because it kind of, I don't know, it does something to that vestibular sense that you enjoy. Not me so much. And then in terms of interoception, I basically don't seem to have it. It just doesn't really happen. I stay up till really late at night when I shouldn't do. I don't drink when I need to. I don't eat when I want to. And even when I do eat, then I overeat because I don't feel full, and I just kind of keep going until I feel rough. Etc. So I've done my work, and now I know ways that I can try and work around these things. I can make sure I've always got a drink available. I've never actually found a successful way of dealing with the overeating thing, but I can find ways of handling little reminders to go for a walk to get some fresh air, because that's important to me, or having a shower, going to the loo, that kind of thing. It's time well spent. if you have the opportunity to really get to grips with your own sensory experience, then it really is time well spent, and it can really make a big difference to your experience. What was the other thing that I wanted to cover? Sorry, it's been an interesting one for me tonight, because I told Joe just before I came onto this, I actually had a bit of a meltdown earlier. And this is the second time this has happened, where I've had not a massive one, but certainly a wobble, just before a talk, not actually related to the talk at all. Talks like this don't tend to worry me too much, but just beforehand. And it's so like weird to then go from that headspace to then doing this, and my map in my head of the talk I was going to give is a bit more blurred than it would normally be, so do bear with me. Yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about what thriving would actually look like for an autistic person. And I guess the easiest way to do this is to imagine a hypothetical, because I'm not going to use myself as an example, because, well, I haven't found it yet, so it would feel hypocritical. I know that I still push myself to do things I shouldn't. I know that I still have ways to go to, really get to grips with my own sensory experience. But I think a really powerful, positive, autistic thriving experience would be an autistic person who had the confidence to not dictate or demand, because that will be pounced upon as negative language, I think, but to have influence over their own environment in considerable ways, especially those environments that they have the most control over. I genuinely believe that an autistic person who's genuinely thriving from a sensory point of view, that you would go into their house and you would notice, if that makes sense. You'd pick up on it, whether you're autistic or not, because it would feel different. It would feel, I don't know, I mean, we're talking hypothetical here, it would feel much quieter. It would feel maybe sparser, maybe busier, depending on their oversensitivity or sensory seeking. It would feel, yeah, sensorially different to the average, I believe. And the reason I think that this is important to envisage is because of what I said earlier about having the kind of courage, really, to actually make that happen, because it can be very difficult to go against society's norms, isn't it? We all know that. We mask for that very reason. We make eye contact with people because we know that we have to meet what society demands of us. So actually having the wherewithal to say, you know what, I'm not going to bow down to this anymore. I am going to go my own way, I think would be very, very visible or very noticeable if you were in their presence. I think it would be a person who was very comfortable to say no to doing things, and was very comfortable to say yes to doing other things that you might not necessarily expect. It would be someone who would advocate for themselves fully and be intolerant of putting themselves through unpleasant situations. It would be somebody who didn't feel apologetic for that, because even when I do manage this kind of advocacy for myself, it's always followed up with a swift apology. I mean, I don't know, is anyone else here a people pleaser, a fawner, doing kind of doing everything that you can to make the people around you just be happy, because that way at least they won't start attacking you or criticizing you or being mean to you. I'm noticing a number going up on the people tab. Is that people putting their hands up? Yes, it is. Excellent, good. Yeah, I think it's a very common thing for autistic people to have. We have to remember all of this stress that we're going through, sensory stress and other stresses too, can lead to kind of traumatic responses, trauma responses. There's a lot to be said for autistic people, certainly once they've reached a certain age, of actually having complex PTSD as a result of just how many things are so tricky and difficult and harrowing and painful and uncomfortable, over and over and over and over again. And of course that means trauma responses. So do we fight, do we flight, do we fawn, do we flop, do we freeze? So lucky they all begin with F, isn't it? It's like the only way I would ever remember them. And I think, yeah, fawning sadly is a very common thing. We just tend to want to please everyone around us and not bother them too much. So a truly autistic thriving person wouldn't do that, I don't think. They wouldn't feel the need to apologize for their sensory needs. They would be confident enough that this is just, you know, in the same way that you wouldn't, I know this is a bit of a might be a bit of a silly analogy, but in the same way that a non-autistic person, they're not going to apologize for the fact they need to have a drink of water, are they? They're not going to apologize for the fact they've got to continue breathing for the, you know, for the foreseeable future. You know, you're not going to get somebody saying, you know, I really must carry on breathing. I do apologize. I know it's inconvenient, but you know, I've got to keep that oxygen going. Otherwise, you know, that would be absolutely bizarre. No one would ever expect someone to do that. So why should we? You know, when it, because it is important. Obviously, I understand it's not quite as important as breathing, but it is important, and we shouldn't be apologizing for needing to create comfort for ourselves. So yeah, this hypothetical, hyper confident, very assertive autistic person, I quite like the idea of them. I just wonder how realistic it is. It's certainly something that I think I would aspire to, and I definitely do set out to try not to apologize quite as much as I do, because you know it's not good for a person's mental health. But there we go. So I think it's something that we should all try and achieve, you know, that ability to thrive authentically as an autistic person. We're not thriving on other people's terms, we're thriving on our own terms. I think in the past, you know, for certainly for some non-autistic people, an autistic person who would successfully mask, that was a success, wasn't it? That was classed as a success story. Look, they're acting like a non-autistic person. Yay, we've won. You know, that's brilliant. They've done really well. And it's like, no, that's not success. That's just enforcing masking, and it comes with a cost. You know, ultimately, of course, masking will lead to burnout. It will lead to depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth. So we have to make it on our own terms, because unfortunately, it's not the terms of the people around us. Their terms of faulty. They don't work properly, and we can't hold ourselves to those ideals because they do not suit or work for us. I do apologize. The last 5 minutes I've like I say than I wanted it to be, but that's what happens when you've had a meltdown earlier in the day. So I do apologise. But it's about 5 to 8, so I guess this is as good a time as any to kind of wrap it up really, and invite questions, because hopefully people have got some. I'll try and answer as many as I realistically can. Please bear in mind, you know, I can't really give targeted advice, not really, you know, because I don't know you, and but I might be able to help in more general ways. So anything come through, Joe, or has it been quiet on that front?
No, we've had a very active excuse me, very active chat, and we've also had a very active Q&A. So just from the chat, to let you know that there's so much relatability about what you're saying, Pete. The things that you're saying are really resonating with the people in the room tonight. We've had a lot of our attendees make comments. Essentially, there's a lot of nodding heads, I think, is probably the best way of describing, excuse me, of describing your talk. But huge thanks for you tonight, and I really appreciate, obviously, like you described, this is coming on the back of a tricky few hours for you before the talk. So yes. Extra special heartfelt thanks to you from us at the team, but also from everyone here tonight for sharing your expertise with us under such trying circumstances.
No problem.
So in terms of the questions that are coming through, there seems to be some themes that are coming through. It's like, how do you know, when you talked about the barriers, one of the key barriers being other people, what strategies and tips do you have for kind of, you know, you said to kind of advocate for oneself? You know, how do you have any particular strategies that have worked for you, or would you be happy to discuss how you've maybe arrived at this point where there are times that you can advocate for yourself? Because obviously you've been quite honest about there being times when you can't. So
yeah, it's always down to the individual kind of relationship you might have with the person, you know, and obviously most of my experience of this will be in a workplace, because I didn't know I was autistic as a kid, so therefore I couldn't really do that. But luckily, of course, my workplace was a school, so I suppose it does kind of hit both points there. I think what really worked for me was information, but delivered kind of positively by myself, if that makes sense. So what I would tend to do is I might share YouTube videos. I definitely did that a couple of times. Share YouTube videos of, I don't know, people who I respect in the community. You know, there's lots of content creators, aren't there, out there, autistic content creators that do posts on YouTube and Instagram and LinkedIn and all these things. So I would often try and collect these so that I was going to people with someone's words that weren't just my own, because that way it felt like I wasn't, you know, that way they couldn't just fob me off and just think that I was just making it up, you know, or because the likelihood is, of course, that, you know, unless they're really good at this, they probably won't know that much about autism. People just don't generally, you know, they really don't as a whole. So it's important, I think, not to expect them to know about this stuff, because certainly I would much rather not have to ask and just wait to be offered. You know, that's my ideal, because I hate putting people out and I hate asking for things, but it's just not realistic. It's just not going to happen, you know, unfortunately, unless you work or go to school in the most, you know, autistically affirming place in the world. It's just very unlikely. So you have to be prepared to educate a little bit, and that's not fair, because, you know, somebody who's struggling, who's under stress, who's vulnerable, should never be put in a position where they have to, you know, then somehow find the spoons or the energy to educate somebody. But we know it happens all the time, don't we? You know, every demographic that's a minority in some way experiences this. You know, the need to educate constantly. It's something that, you know, a lot of minority groups experience all the time. So make it easy for yourself, and like I say, have some links ready. You know, have like I don't know, have a Word document with a load of links to different YouTube videos and Instagram posts ready that you can just send, you know, in a cheery manner. You know, oh, thought you might want to have a look at this because this actually really nails exactly how I feel. So if you could have a watch, and then maybe we could talk about reasonable adjustments. It can be a nice way to avoid the disbelief and the awkwardness of wanting something from somebody else, you know, because you're couching it around this. Watch this, see what you think of this, and taking it from there. So that would be my advice for that. I think there's probably other ways too, but that's the thing that springs to mind.
Thanks, Pete. And I think what you're saying there really sounds doable for you know, certainly an adult, and perhaps even a young adult, an adolescent, or an older child. But we've had a couple of questions from people relating to much younger children.
Yes.
So perhaps, you know, thinking about the primary years, you know, how, you know, your advice, great advice, kind of, you know, invest that time wherever you can find it to really think about one's own sensory profile. But how do we do that with a younger child? I don't know if you have perhaps some personal experience from being a parent yourself, yes, or indeed from being an educator. You know, what advice would you give?
Keep a lot of notes would be my advice on that, because what you'll see it. You'll see sensory overwhelm in your child. It's just recognizing it for what it is, and that's not infallible. You know, sometimes, for example, they might be crying or might be upset for something completely unrelated, but over time patterns will emerge. They will. So what I'd recommend is, you know, everyone's got a smartphone these days. I've got a Samsung, so I've got my what's it called, Samsung Notes or something app on my phone that I just use all the time. You know, like a quick word process that you just whack a, you know, you just write on quickly, and that can be really good, because it gives, whenever you notice it, you can just make a little note, you know, or if you're more into pen and paper, just have like a little diary or a little book or a journal or something where you just make notes of these things and be like, actually, you know, it felt like, you know, the child found this difficult today, so I'll make a note of it, so that then when I have space later on, or, you know, a few weeks down the line, you can kind of cast back and start to identify patterns. I mean, you know, if you're autistic yourself, that pattern spotting might be quite, you know, you might have that quite, you know, be quite good at that, and you can start to develop a picture, you know, certainly for the main five senses, you know, like you know, taste and bad smells and things being too loud. I'll never forget, there was a really nice moment. I don't know if anyone watches the TV program What I Lie to You. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that this comedian's daughter is autistic. That wouldn't be fair, but it was just a really nice example of this. Lee Mack, one of the main guys on the show, realized that his daughter cried at the same point in a particular song whenever he put it on. And he actually made notes of that and like almost experimented with it. I mean, kind of ethically a bit dubious, but he put the song on just to see if it always happened, and it always did. And that, of course, was the am I lying or not? And it was true. This definitely did happen. And I think that's a really nice example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. You notice these triggers, these behaviors. And of course, Lee Mack actually has turned out to be ADHD, hasn't he? So that's quite interesting in itself. But anyway, and that's the kind of thing, so make notes, notice things, and don't doubt yourself. Don't fall into the trap of being like everyone else and doubting sensory experience. If you're autistic yourself, recognize that your child might well have a totally different profile to you. There is no law that states that you're going to be exactly the same at all. And if you're not autistic, remember what I said about the fact that, autistic experience is a real thing, and it might be a bit different to what you're used to, but should never be totally unrelatable, as long as you take the time to think about it. So don't second guess yourself, and allow yourself to actually think, actually, even though it's something I've never experienced, maybe my child really does love, might be seeking behavior. Maybe they really love horrible smells or something unexpected. Keep an open mind, because who knows what that sensory profile could be. It's so varied, it could be anything.
That's really great advice, actually. And if I might add something, if that's all right, Pete,
yeah.
From my own experience. So I have 2 autistic children, and when we discovered our children were autistic, it was a real revelation to go back to home videos. They were really, when I've got videos of my youngest son, who is very sensory averse, in kind of across all the senses really, and I've got videos of holding him when he was a baby, and you could see, even though he can't really hold his head up, poor guy, he's really trying to get away, because so that was a real revelation to me, was to go back to home videos and things, that with this additional knowledge that I then had through the discovery of their autism. I think also, just for those parents and carers who are out there of younger children, occupational therapy services should exist for your autistic child. Obviously the provision is patchy, but it's just a reminder that that service should be available for your child to have an occupational therapy assessment. What's your thoughts on that, Pete? How do you feel as an autistic person about the idea of having kind of assessments for sensory profiles and so forth? Do you have a personal opinion on that?
So long as the person knows what they're talking about, then it's all for the good, really, because it's very difficult to do all this stuff on your own. It can be very overwhelming, and especially if you're autistic yourself, there isn't much out there for autistic parents in terms of support. So if you can get somebody who really knows their stuff, who, in an ideal world, who is neurodivergent themselves, then that could be a massive, massive help. Obviously, unfortunately, though, a bit like with GPs and teachers and every other authority figure that we come across, you might just get somebody who doesn't get it, who doesn't understand. So I think to be comfortable with the idea of, it's easier said than done, but comfortable with the idea of actually saying, actually, you know what, I don't think you get autism very well at all from what I understand of it, so I might need to see somebody else. I think I know a few autistic people that have had to do that with teachers, had to do that with doctors in the past, because, as I said earlier, knowledge about autism is incredibly patchy. You get some non-autistic people who are firmly on top of it, and they're really good and they're really invested and they want to get it right. And then you've got others who, stuck in the 90s, still believe that if you're female or, girl or woman or female presenting, then you can't possibly be autistic. And, and then what do you do? Because you can't fight that kind of outdated set of ideas. You're always going to, people often don't want to be educated, so the second opinion, if possible, I guess is always an option, but might be difficult to achieve. You've got to feel like the person that's helping you knows what they're talking about, because otherwise the stakes are too high for it to be for them to get it wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah, Very good point. We've got a few questions about advocacy within schools. So parents kind of advocating for their children, and then also teachers, trying to build that trust with autistic students so that they can talk about sensory profiles and so forth. But before we get to those, I'm being a bit selfish here and perhaps using the host's privilege to ask a question of my own, and that is, it's a really hot topic in the media at the moment, of course, because of it being a bit of a political hot potato. But we know that there has been a real increase in the numbers of children who are unable to attend school for a variety of different reasons. And we know recent research tells us that neurodivergent children and young people are overrepresented in those numbers. Yeah. Knowing how hard it can be from a sensory perspective in schools, what do you think the relationship might be between the sensory environment of school and burnout that ultimately might lead to being unable to attend school?
I'll be honest with you, I wish I could say this to Rishi Sunak, I really do. I think school refusal is a totally rational, reasonable reaction from an autistic child, given how schools are, given the general experience they may have had in a school. The thing that beggars belief for me is that that anyone could look at the data that shows that neurodivergent, particularly autistic children aren't going to school, would look at that and think that there was something therefore wrong with the parents or the children, is staggering to me. The conclusion is clear as day. Schools are not safe spaces for autistic kids a lot of the time. Not always. I mean, I got through school, to be fair. I'm sitting here hypocritically because I got through school relatively unscathed because I just sat in the background and, internalized everything ready for it to explode later. But no, I mean, goodness me, schools are horrible places for autistic kids, a lot of the time. We shouldn't shy away from that. We should be screaming that from every rooftop. There is nothing autistically safe about the majority of school experiences, from the sensory experience to the monotropic experience, to the communicative experience, to the executive function experience. Everything about the education system is set up to make autistic kids fail, both academically and pastorally and in terms of attendance and everything. And you can probably tell that you've hit a raw nerve here, but I'm prepared to fight anyone who disagrees, to be honest with you, because we are so wedded to an educational system that is very, very old. It really is. The way that we do education, the age that we do it at, the way we structure the school day, the way we structure the school term, the way we build our school buildings, they're all predicated pretty much on Victorian or even earlier precedent. There is very little to do with education, apart from a few things to do with SEND, that is new. From the summer holidays, which are massively disruptive for autistic kids, to the school day, which is massively disruptive to autistic kids, it's all based on very old ideas, and that haven't been reevaluated in decades and are not fit for purpose for autistic children. So for an autistic child to reject school is, in my mind, totally reasonable and rational. The reaction to it is likewise always totally irrational, especially on the part of the school. But often, because of the pressures involved on the part of the parents too, because they're terrified. They don't want to get in trouble with the police, get dragged in front of a court of law and this kind of thing. So what do we, what do we do? We put pressure on the kid. We force the kid to enter an environment that scares the hell out of them and makes them really, really stressed. We put enormous pressure on a disabled child to do something that they pretty much cannot do, and then act surprised when they can't do it. And yeah, sorry, I really have gone off on one, but it bothers me enormously. There's a reason that my next book is going to be all about education, and oh dear, it's going to be an interesting one. ultimately we can't just destroy the whole system and rebuild it from the ground up. I mean, you know, we can, but we can't, you know, it's certainly not quickly. So we have to find ways to manage it within the strictures of what already exists. So we have to find ways to try to address sensory experience in schools, even if we can't totally solve it. And the good news for that is if teachers are willing to listen, it can be really, really, really straightforward. You know, it doesn't have to be that difficult to make sensory adjustments for an autistic child at all. You know, from providing a quiet space that they know they can always go to being allowed to leave lessons 2 minutes early so they avoid the throngs and the crushes in the corridors, to being allowed to not have to have their top button done up, to being allowed to wear their PE kit instead of their uniform, to be allowed to sit by an open window because they like the feelings of fresh air. None of these things cost any money. None of these things even cost that much time. All they require is an element of flexibility on the part of the school. And that, I think, is probably what we need to try and advocate for as the parents and the teachers, you know, as well, you know, who are trying to make things better. I can't remember what the question was exactly because I really have gone off on one there, but I hope I have addressed it a little bit.
Absolutely. You know, it's really, really helpful. And I think that, you know, obviously you're talking from your own personal experience, and you're also talking from your experience as a former secondary school teacher. So, you know, there are lots of educators in the room tonight who are also kind of, you know, doing what they can within the confines of the system that you are describing. One of whom has asked a question about, you know, how, if you know a bit about this stuff as a teacher, that you are kind of, it's on your radar, you know about sensory processing issues, you're aware that the sensory environment can be really tough. How do you make that connection with your autistic students so that you can build that trust, so that you can, you know, develop that conversation with them, so that then you can learn about their sensory profile? Because this might be something that the young person hasn't really fully adapted or fully acknowledged themselves. And then you know, their teacher might be the very last person on earth they want to talk to about this, particularly if they're in adolescence. So what advice would you have for our attendee around that question?
I think that the teachers have a wonderful opportunity a lot of the time with autistic students, because I think, given how autistic students might have experienced life to date, if you, for example, can be that secondary school teacher that actually believes them, you know, you might be the first one. You might be the first one that's genuinely kind of said, you know, just taken them to one side, for example, at the end of a lesson and just said, you know, that must have been tough for you. You know, it was very noisy today. I'm really sorry about that. You know, people got really excited or whatever. You know, do let me know in future if, when it gets to that kind of volume, if you need to step out. You could be the first person that's ever done that. And that in itself can be a huge way to overstep those barriers. You know, you become a very safe person, you know, a very safe person for that individual. So use that opportunity. You know, you have that kind of privilege almost to be that person. But another, I mean, I talk at length about special interests. You know, I wrote a whole book about them. I think that, you know, if you're a teacher and you're in any position to, then take an interest in whatever they're interested in, and you have immediately got rapport a lot of the time. You know, because the interesting thing about, you know, an autistic student's passions and deepest interests is they will have experienced over and over again people being very disinterested in them. You know, not wanting to know or telling them to be quiet or whatever. So, you know, again, if you can take an interest and be like, oh, you know, tell me what's new in the world of X, Y, and Z, then again, that can really overcome some barriers and again, work towards making you a safe person that they can communicate with. And it's important to remember with the whole interest thing that you don't actually need to know about it at all. In order to take an interest. You know, you don't need to go away and do your homework. I mean, in my experience, most autistic people are happy to just tell you stuff, and it's almost better if you don't know about it, because then they're kind of teaching you, and God, we love that. You know, that's wonderful. You know, I love talking about, you know, my interests to people who know nothing on the subject, because I feel like I'm not just info dumping, I'm actually also kind of teaching them something, which makes it feel a bit better somehow. So yeah, don't feel the need to go and do your homework on it. Just let them talk. Let them tell you stuff. And you can find such wonderful connections from that, I think. So that would be another bit of advice, I think.
I think that's a really fantastic piece of advice that works really well in my family. If I want to talk about anything at all, using my children's passions and interests as a vehicle to get to that point is just the most effective thing. We might start talking about 1970s ska music, which is the current flavour of the month. And then we get into it, which is great. I'm happy with that one. But and then it eventually will, that takes us into, other territory as well. So yeah, absolutely. That really resonates with me personally. I appreciate that you've had a tricky day. Do you have capacity for a couple more questions?
Yeah, I can do it. Another couple. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So from the flip side then, so we've had a question from a parent carer who's kind of saying, well, how do I I know my child's sensory profile. How do I then kind of advocate for them in a school setting without making myself unpopular and having to kind of, dance the dance that needs to be done, that you don't kind of, you don't necessarily position yourself as a nuisance or as a difficulty. It's that same thing of like asking for things, but in such a way that is most likely to get a positive response. So from your perspective as a teacher as well, what do you have any pointers for the parents and carers in the room about how to do that effectively?
It's very difficult because you're right. There is unfortunately a very high likelihood that certain parents get identified as being very, like you said, nuisances, and it's completely unreasonable and totally unfair. But unfortunately it does happen. Ways to circumvent it. I mean, obviously all of this is kind of tempered by the fact that, on a very fundamental level, I don't feel like we ought to have to circumvent it. It's like it's so unfair that, it feels awful to kind of suggest ways to try and get around it, because it just shouldn't be. And my sense of justice and reasonableness is very offended by it. But, realistically, yes, we do need ways to be heard and not irritate, and not be, on the phone all the time. Oh God, it's hard. I mean, I think approaching it from the position of practicality is key, I suppose, because if you do ask for things that are unfeasible from the school's perspective, especially if you start with that, then that might make people think, we can't do that. So it's about picking, to start with, picking things that are completely doable, if that makes sense, so that you're starting with something small and easy, and then you can start to build up to things, because ultimately I think there's not much that is totally unfeasible. I think the school will tell you that a lot is totally unfeasible, but actually in reality, if they really did want to, they'd probably be able to do quite a lot. But you need to start small and work your way up, I guess. I mean, that's just general advice for being persuasive generally. You don't want to hit them with all your demands all at once, because it will just shutters come down, and it's just like, no, we can't do that. So you want to kind of sneakily build to the bigger stuff, and go with suggestions, I think, is also a good way of doing things. That's what I've done for my daughter. You go with suggestions of what they could do that are, as I say, very doable, rather than go with the problem and hope that they will have a solution. I mean, that might be necessary sometimes. You might have no idea what the best thing to do is, but if you start with something where you can offer, actually, could you try and do this? I mean, as a teacher, that's the kind of thing you want to hear, because you don't have to then worry about it too much. It's like, oh, the parent wants me to do this, that's fine, I'll do that. And there's no kind of query of, is this the right thing to do? So if you go to them and say, look, is it okay? I mean, a little one. So is it okay for them to wear ear defenders at break time? Okay, it would take a very, very, very particular kind of school to deny that. I think that's a relatively reasonable request, and you're giving them the thing you want them to do, and you're basically just asking for permission. That's relatively easy. Once that's been hopefully granted, then you've opened that dialogue, haven't you? You know, and try and make sure that you're always speaking to the same person, whoever it is. You know, is it their form tutor if it's secondary school? Is it their class teacher if it's primary school, or is it the Senko that you're always talking to? And obviously, if you don't have a result with one of them, there are options. Every school, there are different kind of avenues you can go down. You know, at secondary school, for example, depending on the structure of the school, yeah, you've got the form tutor, but if that doesn't work out, you've often got what would be called like a head of year or a pastoral head or something along those lines. You've got multiple deputies or assistant heads that you could go to if you weren't having much joy. Now, obviously, that will, you know, lead to heckles being raised, but you know, find that port of call, find the ally, find the person who's willing to work with you, you know, and try to always speak with them, so you're not always having to repeat yourself all the blooming time. You know, there's nothing more demotivating than having to go over it all again fresh, you know, with someone new. You just feel like, oh God, you know, you feel like you're asking for the world, and you're not even asking for that much. So try to keep a line of communication open with one person who you know is helpful, and that can make things easier. It's probably easier to do that at secondary school than primary, because there's obviously many more staff, but I think that can work, if that helps.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Pete. So, final question before we wrap up today, and apologies to everyone who's posted questions that we haven't been able to put to Pete tonight. Unfortunately, with such a big group, it is inevitable that some questions don't get answered. But I just want to point out again, PeteWharmby.com. Pete runs his own talk, so there will be plenty of other opportunities for you to talk to Pete in the future as well, through his own platform. So please do make sure you go to his website. But just as a final wrapping up question, of all the amazing advice and experience you've shared with us tonight, if there was just one thing that you think you would like us all to go away from this talk tonight in relation to sensory comfort for autistic people, which bit of the advice you've given us would you think was most important?
I guess it's directed at the non-autistic people in the room, if there are any. Hopefully there are. It's that it's that point about believing more than anything else. Don't be that person that says, no, it's not. Don't be silly. Don't be daft. Don't do that. You know, if an autistic person of any age comes to you and says, I'm uncomfortable for this reason, believe them, even if you can't immediately relate to it, because it's real. Our sensory experience is different. There's nothing you can do about that. That is a fact. Believe them and try and help them do something about it. If you're autistic, I suppose what I would say is the same thing, actually. Believe yourself. Don't second guess yourself. If you are uncomfortable, you are uncomfortable. Don't feel like just because everyone else is fine that you're somehow meant to try and be fine too. Because that's how it feels. You know, you're in like a big room, you're in a pub, or you're in a classroom, or you're on a train or whatever, and you know, you feel desperately uncomfortable, and you look around and everyone else is just fine. You know, they're just fine. You're uncomfortable, and that's okay. So feel free to do something about it. Don't feel bad or feel like it's weird. It's not. You're living your life and you're living your experience. So try not to live other people's, if that makes sense.
Such brilliant advice. Thank you so much, Pete. On behalf of everybody here, and the chat is now going wild with wild applause for you. But thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful, and I can't thank you enough. What a fantastic way to start this series of monthly talks. On the subject of that, next month's speaker, on the 8th of February, we have Andy Smith from Spectrum Gaming, who's going to be talking about the importance of building an autistic community for autistic people. If you're signed up for our newsletter, you'll be sent the link to sign up for that. If you're not signed up for our newsletter, then email us at autism@reading.ac.uk. I don't know if Fiona, you might be able to pop that in the chat for us now. Yes, just sign up and you'll find out about all our talks. But once again, very warm thank you to Pete for tonight. You will get a recording. A link to this will be sent out to you in the coming weeks, hopefully as quickly as possible, so that you can watch this again. So thanks again, Pete.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thanks for organising it. And thanks to everyone who's, you know, come along on a Thursday evening, you know, when we could be watching telly or whatever. It's been really nice to have such good questions and feedback and things like that. So thank you.
Thanks, Pete. All the best. Enjoy
Thanks,
your
Em.
evening. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody who's joined us tonight. I hope you have a lovely evening. See you next time, hopefully.